Have you ever had something so small, so seemingly insignificant, suddenly become the spark of a battle that changes everything? That's what happened to Keith Strong, a retired solar physicist living in an upscale Maryland community when all he wanted was a simple replacement mailbox. Little did he know, his $35 wooden box would ignite a war lasting 7 years, costing tens of thousands of dollars, and drawing national attention to one of the most dreaded forces in American suburbia, the HOA. Keith lived in a quiet golf course neighborhood in Bowie, Maryland. It was the sort of place that prided itself on manicured lawns, winding drives, and rows of pristine million-dollar homes. On the surface, it looked like a peaceful suburban dream. But beneath that calm veneer, the Homeowners Association wielded their absolute power. From the shade of your blinds to the paint on your shutters, everything had to be pre-approved. Residents both respected and feared the HOA because one wrong move could trigger fines, disputes, or worse. In 2009, Keith replaced his old, worn-out mailbox. It was falling apart, its paint chipped, and wood cracked. So he went to the hardware store, picked out a modest but neat $35 wooden mailbox, nearly identical to the one he had before. Importantly, it matched what the HOA had approved in the past. Keith figured it was a no-brainer. It wasn't about making a statement, just maintaining his property in good order. But 2 months later, everything changed. Out of nowhere, the HOA announced that every single homeowner had to remove their current mailbox, no matter its condition, and replace it with a brand new. It's a custom metal mailbox designed with a decorative W emblem for the community. The kicker: mailbox cost $500, no community vote, no discussion, no consultation, just a mandate handed down like gospel from on high. And if you didn't comply, liens and legal action could follow. Residents were outraged. Coffee mornings turned into gripe sessions. Neighbors whispered on sidewalks about the unfairness of it all, but anger soon gave way to resignation. One by one, the families caved, paying the $500 and installing the new shiny box. They grumbled, but complied, figuring it was easier to bow to the HOA than fight a losing battle. See, Keith could easily afford the mailbox. As a retired scientist, money wasn't the issue. But to him, it wasn't about dollars. It was about principle. He saw the decision for what it was, an abuse of power. Today it was mailboxes. Tomorrow it could be fences, windows, or solar panels. If the HOA could force homeowners to buy specific products at inflated prices, where did it stop? So Keith made a choice, refused to install the $500 mailbox. He kept his $35 wooden one planted firmly in the ground. He let the HOA send notices, warnings, and fines. And when they wouldn't back down, Keith escalated the fight. He took them to court. The HOA thought they could intimidate him into compliance. They underestimated just how stubborn Keith Strong could be. He wasn't just a homeowner with principles. He was a scientist trained to analyze, prepare, and persevere. For him, this wasn't just about a box of wood and nails. It was about exposing a system that thrived on control and conformity. Neighbors shook their heads. Some admired his stand. Others called it foolish. "Why waste your time and money over a mailbox?" they asked. But Keith knew something deeper was at stake. If he rolled over here, it would set a precedent that gave the HOA free rein to push through any costly mandate they wanted in the future. The HOA responded with aggression. They began fining Keith $100 per month for known compliance. Letters poured in. Threats of liens and property action loomed, but Keith didn't budge. He documented every notice, every threat, every fine, stacking evidence like ammunition. He was preparing for a war of attrition, and war it was. From 2010 onward, Keith's days were filled with legal paperwork, hearings, and endless correspondence. While his neighbors lived their suburban routines, Keith was neck-deep in legal filings and HOA bylaws. The HOA hired lawyers, pushed motions, and dragged the process out year after year, confident they could wear him down. They assumed that eventually, like everyone else, he would just give in. But Keith wasn't everyone else. He endured the ridicule, the sideways looks, the mutters of "there goes the crazy mailbox guy." He paid out of pocket for legal help, watching fees pile up into the tens of thousands. And every time he looked at his little $35 mailbox, still standing firm by his driveway, it reminded him why he fought. This wasn't just about aesthetics. This was about autonomy, about refusing to be bullied by a committee of neighbors, acting like kings over their castle. And so, with his mailbox as a symbol of defiance, Keith marched into a legal battle that would consume the next 7 years of his life. A $35 box of wood had now become the front line in a war between an ordinary man and an overreaching HOA. But Keith Strong wasn't about to back down. Not now. Not ever. The HOA thought Keith would fold in a matter of months. After all, that's what usually happened. Most homeowners complained, maybe stalled a little, but eventually they gave in, paid up, and installed whatever the HOA demanded. But Keith was different. With every fine they sent, with every letter threatening liens or legal action, Keith only grew more determined to fight. From 2010 onward, the battle transformed into a grueling war of attrition. Every 30 days, Keith received a notice. $100 in fines added to his record. That meant over a year's time, the fines alone stacked into more than $1,000, and by the end of several years, the figure ballooned. But Keith refused to write a check. He wasn't just resisting the mailbox. He was resisting the HOA's unchecked power to reach into his wallet without reason. Neighbors began to whisper about the man who wouldn't let it go. Some were supportive, admiring his courage to stand against what they themselves didn't dare fight. Others were less sympathetic, rolling their eyes, calling him stubborn or dismissing him as that crazy mailbox guy. But Keith didn't care. Popularity contests meant nothing when principle was at stake. The HOA escalated. They offered deals, discounted fines, partial forgiveness if he'd just agreed to install the $500 mailbox. But Keith saw those offers for what they were: bait to make him surrender. And every time he said no, the HOA's frustration grew. By the third year, the legal system became his second home. Motions, hearings, depositions. It was an endless stream of paperwork. Keith had no legal background, but he learned quickly. Poured through HOA bylaws, researched property law, and consulted attorneys who guided him through the labyrinth. He wasn't just fighting for himself, he was setting a precedent that could ripple through. Ha-ha, a run, neighborhoods across the country? The costs mounted. Legal fees piled into the tens of thousands. By the fourth year, Keith had spent over $20,000. Friends questioned his sanity. "Keith, you could have bought 10 of those mailboxes by now," one told him. But Keith always had the same reply. "It's not about the mailbox. It's about my rights. If I give in now, they'll never stop." The HOA, for its part, was just as stubborn. They believed that, as long as they dragged things out, Keith's wallet would eventually give way. They used every tactic, filing counterclaims, requesting delays, drowning him in motions designed to exhaust his patience and resources. But Keith was unshakable. Every document, every letter, every legal notice, he saved it, studied it, prepared his counterarguments. While the HOA thought they could bury him in bureaucracy, Keith quietly built a fortress of evidence. 7 years. That's how long the war dragged on. 7 years of constant pressure, mounting expenses, and ridicule from those who thought he was fighting a pointless battle. And then, finally, the moment came. In 2017, Keith walked into a Prince George's County courtroom for the trial that would decide the fate of his little $35 mailbox. Sitting on the other side were the HOA board members and their attorneys, armed with binders and prepared statements. The judge listened patiently as the HOA made its case. They argued that uniformity was essential to preserving property values, that the $500 mailbox design represented the character of the community, and that homeowners had agreed by contract to follow the board's decisions. Then it was Keith's turn. He didn't come in blustering or emotional. Instead, he laid out the facts with the precision of a scientist. He showed that the original mailbox he installed was consistent with prior approvals. He demonstrated that the HOA had changed the rules without proper consultation or homeowner votes, violating their own bylaws. And most importantly, he argued that forcing homeowners to buy a specific product from a specific vendor was not within the legal powers of an HOA. The courtroom was silent as he spoke. This wasn't about one stubborn man versus his neighbors. It was about something far bigger. Whether HOAs could dictate private purchases and hold homeowners hostage with fines until they complied. And when the gavel finally came down, the decision was clear. The judge ruled in Keith's favor. The HOA had exceeded its authority. They could not force homeowners to buy a specific mailbox at a specific price. Keith was allowed to keep his $35 wooden box, and the $500 mandate was struck down as unlawful. It was vindication, 7 long years, $33,000 in legal fees, and endless ridicule finally paying off. Keith had stood his ground, and the law had backed him up. Reporters soon picked up the story. The Washington Post wrote about the mailbox battle that had consumed nearly a decade of Keith's life. Headlines across the country marveled at the idea of a man spending tens of thousands of dollars to protect a $35 mailbox, but those who looked deeper understood. It was never just about wood and nails. It was about principle, freedom, and property rights. Keith became a symbol of defiance against HOA overreach. Homeowners from around the country reached out, sharing their own battles with overzealous associations. Keith's victory gave them hope that standing firm could make a difference, even if the fight seemed impossible. But as satisfying as the courtroom victory was, Keith's battle wasn't truly over. Because just when he thought the war had ended, something darker and more personal happened, something that showed how bitter his opponents had become. One morning, Keith walked outside to collect his mail. The sight that greeted him turned his triumph into a fresh wound. His mailbox, the same $35 wooden box he had fought for over 7 long years, had been smashed to pieces. For 7 years, Keith Strong had waged a lonely war against his homeowners association. He endured fines, threats, ridicule, and $33,000 in legal fees. And yet, when the gavel struck in 2017, he walked out of the courtroom victorious. His $35 mailbox still stood proudly in front of his Bowie, Maryland home, backed by the full weight of the law. It should have been the end of the story. a clean victory, a moment of peace. But sometimes, winning in court doesn't mean the fight is over. Not long after the judge's ruling, Keith walked outside one morning to find something that left his stomach hollow. His mailbox, the very same little wooden box he had defended for nearly a decade, was gone. Not removed neatly, not taken down with care. It had been ripped apart, smashed, destroyed in the night by someone who didn't want him to enjoy his victory. Splinters of wood and twisted metal lay scattered at the foot of his driveway. For Keith, it was a gut punch. He knew exactly what this was: retaliation. No culprit was ever caught. No one came forward to confess. But Keith had little doubt the destruction wasn't random. After all, what were the chances that after nearly a decade of conflict, his mailbox just happened to be targeted right after his court victory? To Keith, it was as if someone wanted to send him a final message. You may have won the battle, but we'll never forget. It was petty. It was spiteful. But it also proved exactly why he had fought in the first place. Keith didn't let the act of vandalism break him. He replaced the mailbox and moved forward. What mattered wasn't the wooden post at the end of his driveway, was the principle he had defended and the precedent he had set. Because of his fight, his neighbors were no longer forced to buy a $500 mailbox they hadn't voted for. Because of his stubbornness, HOAs everywhere were put on notice that their power had limits. And as word spread, Keith's story became bigger than a neighborhood dispute. The Washington Post, the Sun, and even television news stations picked up the story, dubbing it the Mailbox War. Reporters marveled that a man would spend 7 years and $33,000 to defend a mailbox worth only $35. To outsiders, it sounded absurd comedy almost. But those who had lived under the thumb of an HOA understood immediately. Keith's fight wasn't about the money. It was about freedom. Homeowners from across the country reached out with letters, emails, and phone calls. They told him about being fined for garden gnomes, ordered to remove vegetable plots, or forced to repaint shutters because the color wasn't in harmony. They saw themselves in Keith's battle. It'd become a symbol for every ordinary homeowner pushed around by people who believed rules were more important than rights. His case even made waves in legal discussions. Property rights advocates pointed to Keith's victory as an example of why checks and balances were needed in HOA governance. Legal blogs and homeowner rights groups cited his story when advising others facing overreach. He had turned a personal grudge match into a landmark moment of accountability. Of course, not everyone saw him as a hero. Some neighbors remained critical, muttering that Keith had wasted time and money over a trivial issue. Why didn't he just buy the mailbox and be done with it? They asked. But those critics missed the larger point. If Keith had folded, the HOA would have been emboldened. Today it was mailboxes. Tomorrow, it could have been mandatory landscaping contracts, overpriced security systems, or even rules about what kind of car you could park in your driveway. Keith knew that once you surrendered to unfair authority, you gave it permission to grow. And so, he stood his ground, knowing that his battle was about far more than a box at the end of his driveway. Even in the aftermath of the smashed mailbox, the lingering tension, Keith had no regrets. When asked later if it was worth it, he said yes. Every dollar, every hour, every sneer from those who thought he was wasting his time, it was worth it to prove that one person could hold the line against an entire system. His fight reminds us that sometimes the biggest battles grow from the smallest sparks. A $35 wooden mailbox became a rallying cry for homeowners' rights across America. So the next time you hear someone complain about their HOA, Think of Keith Strong, the man who wouldn't bow, the man who turned a mailbox into a symbol of resistance. And I'll ask you this. Have you ever been pushed by an HOA, a boss, or even a neighbor, to the point where you had to choose between giving in or standing your ground? What would you have done in Keith's place? Because if Keith's story teaches us anything, it's that sometimes even the smallest stand can carry the biggest message. Your rights are worth fighting for.